There are moments in your life that are not loud. They do not announce themselves with thunder or fanfare. They arrive quietly, disguised as something ordinary, like the gentle settling of dust in a sunbeam or the slow, rhythmic exhale of a sleeping man. These are the moments that become the axis upon which your entire world pivots. You don't recognize them as they happen, of course. You are too busy living them, too caught up in the sensory details, the weight of a head in your lap, the faint scent of rain-damp cotton, the profound stillness that has fallen over a room that is usually humming with a low-grade, anxious energy. For me, that moment was a Tuesday night in late October, with Julian asleep on my couch. His body finally surrendered to an exhaustion so deep it felt elemental. His declaration, made just minutes before he succumbed to sleep, still hung in the air, a fragile, invisible tapestry woven from just a few simple words. He had said he didn't want to be a burden. And then, he had only truly relaxed, only let go of the last thread of tension coiling in his spine, when I had placed my hand on his back. It was a gesture I had made without thinking, an instinctual act of comfort, but in the silence that followed, it felt like a confession. My confession, not his. And as I sat there, a prisoner of his trust and my own treacherous hope, I understood that the careful architecture of the life I had built around him, a fortress of friendship designed to protect my own heart, had just sustained its first, critical fracture. We had met in the way people often do in college, thrown together by the arbitrary logic of a shared elective. It was a photography class, something I took for my major, and he took to fulfill a fine arts credit he'd been putting off for 3 semesters. Julian was, even then, a force of nature. He moved through the world with a kind of restless, kinetic energy, as if he were constantly vibrating at a higher frequency than everyone else. He was studying computer science, a discipline of logic and order, yet he himself seemed to be a beautiful, chaotic system. He was all bright smiles, easy laughter, and a casual confidence that drew people to him like moths to a flame. I, on the other hand, was a creature of the quiet and the dark. My natural habitat was the darkroom, a space of chemical smells, soft red light, and patient observation. I found my voice not in words but in images, in the way light could fall across a face and reveal a truth the person themselves might not even know they possessed. I was a watcher, a collector of moments, and Julian, from the very first day, was the most captivating subject I had ever seen. Our friendship formed in the spaces between our differences. He was fascinated by the slow, alchemical process of developing film, the way an image could bloom into existence on a blank sheet of paper submerged in a tray of chemicals. He would lean against the doorframe of the darkroom, arms crossed, and pepper me with questions, his mind, so used to the clean binary of code, grappling with the analog magic of silver and light. I, in turn, was drawn into his orbit. He pulled me out of my quiet corners and into the loud, vibrant world he inhabited. He introduced me to his friends, took me to parties I would have never attended on my own, and somehow made me feel like I belonged there. He never seemed to notice my inherent quietness as a lack. Instead, he treated it as a kind of calm center, a place he could return to when the whirlwind of his own life became too much. We were an odd pairing, the sun and the satellite that was content to circle in its steady, predictable path, warmed by a light it could never hope to possess for itself. My feelings for him were a secret I kept locked away in the most secure vault of my heart. They were a low, constant hum beneath the surface of our friendship, a truth I learned to live with, like a chronic but manageable ache. Loving Julian from a distance was, in its own way, simple. It required nothing of me but my silence. I watched him navigate a series of relationships, each one a bright, brief flare that would eventually burn itself out. I was the constant, the friend he came to afterward to dissect what went wrong, the one who would listen without judgment as he lamented his own inability to make things stick. Each time, I would offer quiet comfort, my own feelings a carefully censored transcript of what I really wanted to say. I became an expert in the art of platonic intimacy, learning the precise boundaries of how long a hug could last, the exact pressure of a hand on a shoulder that communicated support without betraying the yearning underneath. It was a delicate, exhausting performance, but the alternative, risking the most important friendship in my life for a love that was likely unrequited, was unthinkable. So I remained the quiet observer, the photographer documenting a life I was a part of, but never truly at the center of. My camera roll was filled with him. Julian laughing with his head thrown back. Julian focused intently on a line of code, his brow furrowed in concentration. Julian looking out a window, caught in a moment of thought, his profile sculpted by the afternoon light. They were beautiful images, technically proficient and emotionally resonant. They were also the loneliest photographs I had ever taken. The shift, when it came, was not sudden. It was a slow erosion, like water wearing away stone. Julian had graduated and taken a demanding job at a tech consulting firm. The work was prestigious and challenging, but it consumed him. The bright, kinetic energy that had once defined him began to curdle into a kind of frantic, anxious exhaustion. He was always on, always connected, his mind a relentless engine of problem-solving that he couldn't seem to switch off. The easy laughter became rarer, replaced by a weary sigh that seemed to carry the weight of impossible deadlines and demanding clients. His life, which had once been a sprawling landscape of social engagements and varied interests, had contracted until it was little more than the path between his sterile downtown apartment and his glass-walled office. The vibrant, chaotic system had been forced into a rigid, unforgiving algorithm, and the strain was beginning to show. He started showing up at my apartment unannounced. My place was a small, quiet sanctuary in a much older, more human-scaled neighborhood, filled with books and plants and the lingering smell of darkroom chemicals. It was the antithesis of his own minimalist, modern space. He would arrive late, usually after 10, looking frayed and hollowed out. He wouldn't say much at first. He would just drop his laptop bag by the door with a heavy thud, shed his shoes, and collapse onto my worn, comfortable couch as if his strings had been cut. He would talk about his day in a flat monotone, the words spilling out of him not as a conversation but as a data dump, a purging of the day's accumulated stress. He spoke of system architecture and client expectations and deployment schedules, a language I barely understood, but I knew my role was not to understand, but simply to listen. I was the empty vessel he could pour his anxieties into, and I performed this duty with the same quiet diligence I applied to everything else in our friendship. I would make him tea he rarely finished and listen until his words wound down into silence, until the only sound in the room was the hum of the refrigerator and his own ragged breathing. The first time he fell asleep on the couch, it felt like an accident. He had been mid-sentence, his voice growing slower and heavier, until it simply trailed off. I looked over and saw that his eyes had closed, his head lolling to one side against the back of the sofa. A profound stillness settled over him, a complete cessation of the restless energy that always surrounded him. His face, in sleep, lost its tight, anxious lines. He looked younger, more vulnerable, like the boy I had met in that photography class all those years ago. I didn't have the heart to wake him. I gently took the cooling mug of tea from his hand, draped a blanket over him, and turned off the main lights, leaving only a small lamp burning in the corner. I went to my own bed feeling a strange and dangerous mixture of tenderness and sorrow. He was here, in my space, vulnerable and unguarded in a way he never was with anyone else. And yet, he was a world away, lost in a sleep born of pure, unadulterated exhaustion. It felt like a sacred trust, and I was terrified of it. This became our new ritual, the unspoken rhythm of our weeks. 2, sometimes 3 nights a week, I would hear the familiar soft knock on my door, and I would open it to find Julian, looking like a soldier returning from a war I couldn't see. The couch became his bed. The pretense that he might go home was gradually abandoned. He started leaving a toothbrush in my bathroom, a spare shirt in my closet. Our lives, once parallel, were beginning to converge in this small, quiet space. Each time he fell asleep, I would perform the same small rites. Cover him with the blanket, turn down the lights, and retreat to my own room, my heart a confused and aching drum in my chest. I was becoming the curator of his exhaustion, the keeper of his brief moments of peace. The intimacy of it was breathtaking and agonizing. It was everything I had ever wanted and nothing I could ever claim. We were living in a liminal space, somewhere between friendship and something more, a territory with no maps and no rules. The couch, however, was not designed for a 6'2" man to sleep on regularly. One morning, Julian woke up groaning, his hand pressed to the small of his back. He moved stiffly, like an old man, and I watched him with a pang of guilt. "Your couch is trying to kill me, Leo," he said, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his tired eyes. My own bed was a queen, more than big enough for two. The thought appeared in my mind, fully formed and terrifying in its implications. But I said nothing. The couch was a boundary. It was a clear, physical demarcation. This is my space, that is yours. To offer him my bed felt like erasing that line, like inviting a tidal wave into a carefully manicured garden. It was Julian who finally crossed the threshold, as it had always been Julian who initiated every forward movement in our friendship. A few nights later, he arrived looking worse than I had ever seen him. There were dark, bruised-looking circles under his eyes, and his skin had a pale, waxy sheen. He didn't even make it to the couch, just leaned against the closed door behind him and slid down to the floor. "I can't," he whispered, his voice raspy. "I think if I sleep on that couch one more time, my spine will actually snap in half." He looked up at me, his expression a mixture of desperation and apology. "Is it? Would it be insane if I just slept on your floor? The rug is softer than the couch. The absurdity of it, the raw exhaustion that would make a man prefer a floor to a sofa, broke through my carefully constructed defenses. "Don't be an idiot, Julian," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "You can take the bed. I'll take the couch." He shook his head immediately, a flicker of his old self returning. "No way. It's your bed. I'm the one invading your space. We can share. It's big enough. We're not in middle school. We can sleep in the same bed without it being weird." He said it so casually, so dismissively. Without it being weird. For him, perhaps. For me, the idea was a supernova of weird. It was a scenario my mind had conjured in its most secret, hopeful moments. But to have it presented so practically, so devoid of the emotional weight I attached to it, was dizzying. But looking at the sheer, bone-deep weariness in his eyes, I knew I couldn't refuse. To do so would be to admit that it was weird for me, that it meant something more, and that was a confession I was not prepared to make. "Okay," I agreed, my own voice sounding distant to my ears. "Okay, fine." That first night was a study in exquisite torture. I lay on the very edge of my side of the bed, my body rigid, my muscles locked in a state of hyper-awareness. I could feel the heat radiating from his body across the small gulf of mattress between us. I could hear every breath he took, the soft rustle of the sheets as he shifted his weight. I was acutely conscious of my own breathing, trying to keep it slow and even, terrified that any sign of my inner turmoil would be audible in the quiet room. Julian, for his part, was asleep within minutes. His exhaustion was an anchor, pulling him down into the deep, and he was gone. I, however, lay awake for hours, staring at the familiar shadows on my ceiling, feeling like an astronaut who had untethered himself and was now floating in a vast, terrifying, and beautiful new space. He was so close. After years of maintaining a careful, calculated distance, he was right there, a hand's breadth away. It was a proximity that felt both like a gift and a punishment. The nights in the same bed became the new ritual. The initial stiffness between us began to soften. The first time we touched by accident, his foot brushing against my leg, I flinched as if I'd been burned. He mumbled an apology in his sleep and rolled away. But gradually, the accidental touches became less jarring. A hand thrown out in a dream might land on my back. A knee might press against mine. Each instance was a small electric shock to my system, a jolt of pure, unadulterated feeling that I would have to spend the next day carefully analyzing and dissecting, trying to convince myself it meant nothing. It was just the logistics of two bodies sharing a finite space. It was just sleep. But my heart, stubborn and hopeful, refused to believe it. It collected these small, meaningless moments like treasures, hoarding them against the long, lonely days. The architecture of our intimacy was built on a foundation of plausible deniability. He needed a place to sleep. My bed was more comfortable than my couch. We were just friends. Any physical contact was an accident, a byproduct of shared space. This unspoken agreement allowed the ritual to continue, to deepen, without either of us having to acknowledge what might be growing in the space between us. I became a master of interpreting the subtle language of his sleeping body. I could tell the difference between the nights when his sleep was deep and restful and the nights when it was shallow and troubled, his limbs twitching with the residue of a stressful day. On those nights, a low hum of anxiety seemed to emanate from him even in sleep, a tension that radiated into the mattress. He would murmur in his sleep, fragmented words about servers and deadlines. It was on one of those nights that the next wall came down. He had been particularly stressed for a week, working on a massive project launch that had gone badly. He arrived at my door well after midnight, looking shattered. In bed, he couldn't settle. He tossed and turned, the sheets twisting around him, his breathing shallow and quick. I lay still, listening to his distress, feeling helpless. After what felt like an hour of his restless movement, he rolled onto his back and stared at the ceiling, his eyes wide open in the dim light filtering in from the street. "I can't turn it off," he whispered to the darkness. His voice was thin and frayed. "My brain. It just won't stop." I didn't know what to say. The usual platitudes felt hollow and useless. So I stayed silent, just breathing with him in the dark. A few moments passed. "I feel like I don't know, a burden," he said, the words heavy with self-reproach. "Showing up here all the time, taking over your bed." "I'm sorry, Leo, you're not a burden, Julian," I said, and the words felt desperately inadequate. They were just sounds in a dark room, powerless against the storm raging inside his head. He didn't respond, just let out another long, shuddering sigh. And then, without conscious thought, my body moved before my mind could veto it. I reached out and placed my hand flat against his back, right between his shoulder blades. It was a simple, grounding gesture. I didn't rub his back. I didn't say anything else. I just rested my hand there, a point of steady, quiet pressure. Under my palm, I felt it. A tremor ran through him, a barely perceptible shudder. And then, slowly, miraculously, the tension began to leak out of him. The rigid set of his shoulders softened. The rapid, shallow breaths deepened, slowing into a more natural rhythm. It was like watching a tightly wound spring slowly uncoil. He let out a breath that sounded different from the others, not a sigh of stress, but a deep, releasing exhalation of surrender. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I could feel the change through my hand. I could feel the frantic energy that was always buzzing around him finally dissipate. He had said he didn't want to be a burden, and yet, it was only this small, physical act of connection, of me taking on a tiny piece of his physical tension, that allowed him to find peace. Within minutes, his breathing evened out completely, and he was asleep. A real sleep this time, deep and still. I left my hand there for a long time, long after he was lost to the world. The warmth of his back seeped into my palm. It felt like I was holding the core of him, the quiet, vulnerable center that he kept so well hidden from the rest of the world. This was a new level of intimacy, one that transcended the accidental brushes of our legs or the shared space of the mattress. This was intentional. This was me offering comfort, and him, in his unconscious state, accepting it. It was a silent conversation, a profound and terrifying exchange. A part of me, the cautious, self-protective part, screamed at me to pull my hand away, to retreat back to the safety of my own side of the bed. But I couldn't. This felt too important. It felt like I was holding something incredibly fragile and precious, and to move would be to shatter it. So I stayed, my hand on his back, until my own arm grew numb, a silent sentinel guarding his sleep. That gesture became the final, most crucial piece of our nightly ritual. It was no longer a question. When he would get into bed, his body still thrumming with the day's anxiety, he would roll onto his side, his back to me, and he would wait. It was an unspoken invitation, and I would reach out and place my hand on his back. Sometimes he would fall asleep almost instantly, the touch acting like a switch, turning off the noise in his head. Other nights, he would lie awake for a while, and we would talk softly in the darkness. The conversations we had in those moments were different from our daytime talks. They were quieter, more honest. He would tell me about his fears, his insecurities about his job, his feeling of being an imposter who was just one mistake away from being found out. He stripped away the layers of casual confidence he wore like armor during the day, and he showed me the raw, uncertain person underneath. And I would listen, my hand a constant, steady presence on his back, a silent promise that he was not alone in the dark. My world began to shrink until it was the size of my queen-sized bed. My own life, my photography, my other friends, they all started to feel like they were happening on a distant shore. The only thing that felt real, the only thing that mattered, was these quiet, nocturnal hours with Julian. I was living a half-life, dormant during the day and coming alive only in the darkness of my bedroom. The hope I had so carefully suppressed for years was now a wild, unmanageable thing, a vine growing unchecked, threatening to break through the walls of my chest. Every night, I would lie next to him and ask myself the same questions. What was this? What were we doing? Was it possible that he was feeling something too, something he couldn't articulate? Or was I just a convenience, a human weighted blanket he used to help him sleep? The ambiguity was tearing me apart, but the thought of losing this, of going back to the way things were before, was even more terrifying. So I said nothing. I just kept placing my hand on his back, and I waited. The breaking point came, as all breaking points do, on an ordinary night that had started just like any other. Julian had arrived, we had shared a quiet meal, and now we were in bed. The city hummed outside the window, a distant, muffled soundtrack to our small, contained world. I performed the ritual, placing my hand on his back. But tonight, he didn't relax. The tension remained coiled in his muscles. He was unnaturally still, his breathing too controlled. We lay in silence for a long time. The space between us felt charged, filled with all the words we had never said. I could feel my own heart beating a frantic, uneven rhythm against the mattress. I was about to ask him if he was okay when he moved. He rolled over slowly, deliberately, to face me. In the dim light, I could just make out the shape of his face, the dark pools of his eyes fixed on mine. "Leo," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It was thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "Yeah," I whispered back, my throat suddenly dry. He was so close. I could feel his breath on my face. His eyes searched mine in the darkness, and I felt completely exposed, as if he could see every secret, every hope, every fear I had ever harbored for him. Time seemed to slow down, to stretch and warp. The hum of the city faded away. The world contracted to this single moment, this single question hanging in the air between us. "Would it be okay?" he started, then stopped. He swallowed, and I saw the bob of his Adam's apple. He tried again. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The words were so soft, so tentative, yet they landed in my chest like a physical blow. All the air left my lungs. For a moment, I was sure I had imagined it, that my own desperate longing had finally conjured a phantom of my deepest desire. But he was still there, his eyes wide and vulnerable, waiting for an answer. This was it, the moment I had simultaneously craved and dreaded for years. The precipice. One word from me would change everything, forever. There would be no going back. The safe, painful comfort of our ambiguous friendship would be shattered, and we would be left to navigate the wreckage. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through me. The fear of this being a mistake. The fear of him not really knowing what he was asking. The fear of losing him, the one constant in my life. But then, I looked into his eyes, and what I saw there was not confusion or impulse. It was a deep, quiet yearning that mirrored my own. It was the same vulnerability I saw in him when he was asleep, but this time, he was wide awake. He was choosing this. He was asking. And in that moment, all the years of patient waiting, of silent aching, coalesced into a single, simple truth. The risk of losing him was terrifying, but the risk of not knowing, of spending the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I had said yes, was infinitely worse. I didn't trust my voice, so I just nodded. A small, almost imperceptible movement. But it was enough. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, to change my mind. But I didn't move. I met him halfway, and his lips touched mine. It was not a kiss of passion or fire. It was a question. It was a confession. It was soft and hesitant and breathtakingly gentle. It tasted of uncertainty and a hope so fragile it felt like it could break at any moment. It was the quietest, most earth-shattering thing I had ever experienced. It was the sound of a lock I had carried for years finally clicking open. When he pulled back, he didn't go far. Our foreheads rested together, our breath mingling in the small space between us. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. In the silent, charged darkness of my bedroom, a new language was being born, one that had no need for words. And for the first time in a very long time, the quiet in my heart felt not like loneliness, but like peace. The morning after was a landscape of blinding, beautiful terror. I woke up slowly, drifting up from a sleep deeper than any I had experienced in months. For a blissful, unthinking moment, I felt a sense of profound peace. Then memory returned, flooding my senses with the ghost of the kiss, the feeling of Julian's lips on mine, the silent understanding that had passed between us in the dark. I turned my head, a hopeful, nervous smile already forming on my face. The other side of the bed was empty. The sheets were cold. A hollow had been carved out of the morning, a Julian-shaped absence that felt more vast and empty than the space had ever felt before he had started sleeping there. I sat up, my heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. A frantic internal negotiation began. Maybe he just got up early for work. Maybe he was in the kitchen making coffee. Maybe he was just trying to be quiet and not wake me. I clung to these possibilities like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. I swung my legs out of bed and walked out of the bedroom. The apartment was silent. His laptop bag was gone from its usual spot by the door. His shoes were gone. A single, forgotten sock lay on the floor near the couch, a sad, lonely monument to his hasty departure. He was gone. He had fled. A cold dread, familiar and unwelcome, seeped into my bones. I had been wrong. I had misread everything. The kiss had been a mistake, an impulse born of exhaustion and emotional confusion on his part. And now, in the clear, unforgiving light of day, he had realized his error and run. The beautiful, fragile thing that had been born in the darkness had not survived the dawn. I felt a wave of shame so powerful it made me physically nauseous. I had let my hope get the better of me. I had allowed myself to believe, for a few short hours, that my secret love might actually be returned. I had been a fool. I picked up my phone. No text. No missed call. Just a blank screen that seemed to mock my anxiety. I spent the day in a fog of misery and self-recrimination. Every creak of the old building, every footstep in the hall outside my door, sent a jolt of false hope through me. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, dissecting it, analyzing it, searching for the clue I must have missed. Had I been too eager? Not eager enough. Had my nod been too quick? Too slow? It was a useless, agonizing exercise. The silence from him was the only answer I needed. For the next 3 days, he was a ghost. He didn't show up at my apartment. My texts to him, casual, carefully worded inquiries about his well-being, were met with short, delayed responses. Hey, busy at work. Yeah, project is crazy. Talk soon. Each terse message was a small, sharp blow. He was building a wall between us, brick by digital brick. The intimacy we had cultivated over months was dissolving, evaporating like mist. The ache of his absence was a physical presence in my apartment. The couch looked too empty. The other side of my bed felt like a barren wasteland. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy and suffocating. I had risked our friendship, the bedrock of my adult life, and I had lost. The pain of it was a dull, constant throb, a sorrow so profound it felt like a part of my own body had been amputated. On the 4th day, I couldn't take it anymore. The not knowing, the living in this limbo of unanswered questions, was worse than any confirmation of my fears. I knew I had to face him. I had to hear it from his own mouth. I needed the finality of it, the clean break, so I could begin the long, arduous process of grieving what I had lost and trying to piece my heart back together. I put on my jacket, my hands shaking slightly, and walked the 10 blocks to his apartment building. It felt like the longest walk of my life. Every step was a battle between the need for closure and the instinct to turn back, to retreat into the relative safety of my own misery. I stood outside his apartment door for a full minute, my hand hovering over the buzzer. What was I even going to say? How do you demand an explanation for a ghost? Finally, I took a deep breath and pressed the button. I heard the faint buzz from inside, followed by silence. I waited. Nothing. I was about to press it again, my stomach twisting into a tight knot of rejection, when I heard the sound of a lock turning. The door opened a few inches, and Julian peered out. He looked terrible. He was wearing the same t-shirt and sweatpants I had seen him in 4 days ago, now rumpled and stained. His hair was a mess, and his eyes were bloodshot, the dark circles underneath them more pronounced than ever. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. He looked haunted. He didn't seem surprised to see me, just resigned. "Leo," he said, his voice a rough croak. He didn't open the door any wider. "Can I come in?" I asked, my own voice steadier than I felt. He hesitated for a moment, then sighed and stepped back, pulling the door open. I walked into his apartment. The minimalist space, usually so neat and orderly, was in a state of chaos. Takeout containers littered the coffee table, clothes were strewn over a chair, and a stack of mail lay unopened on the counter. The air was stale and heavy. This was not the apartment of a man who was simply busy with work. This was the apartment of a man who was falling apart. "What's going on, Julian?" I asked, turning to face him. I had intended to sound angry, or at least firm, but my voice came out softer, laced with a concern I couldn't hide. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stood there, his arms wrapped around himself as if he were cold, and stared at a spot on the floor. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. "I'm so sorry, Leo. I messed everything up." "What did you mess up?" I pressed, needing to hear him say it. "The kiss? Is that what this is about? If it was a mistake, just tell me. I'm a big boy, I can handle it. But this disappearing act, I don't deserve that." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a misery so profound it stole my breath. "Of course it wasn't a mistake," he whispered, his voice cracking. "That's the problem. It wasn't a mistake. It was the most honest thing I've done in years." I just stared at him, confused. "Then I don't understand. Why did you run? Why have you been avoiding me?" He let out a harsh, broken sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. He ran a hand through his hair, his movements agitated. "Because I don't know what I'm doing," he burst out, his voice rising with frustration. "Because I come to your place and I fall apart. And you just take care of me. You listen to my crap. You let me invade your space. You put up with me. And I lean on you, Leo. I lean on you so hard I'm afraid I'm going to break you." He started pacing the small living room, his restless energy back in full force. But this time it was frantic, panicked. "And then I kissed you. And it was right. It felt more right than anything has in a very long time. And that terrified me. Because what if I'm just using you? What if I'm so lonely and so exhausted that I'm just clinging to the one good, steady thing in my life, and I'm going to ruin it? What if I ruin you?" He stopped pacing and looked at me, his chest heaving. "You are the best person I know. You're my best friend. And I'm turning you into my caretaker, my therapist. And now, something else. It's not fair to you. I can't do that to you." I listened to his torrent of words, and the anger and hurt that I had been carrying for 4 days began to dissolve, replaced by a wave of aching tenderness. He hadn't run because he didn't care. He had run because he cared too much. He had run because he was afraid not of his own feelings, but of the damage he thought those feelings could do to me. He saw himself as a burden, a destructive force, and he was trying to protect me from himself. The beautiful, stupid, selfless idiot. "You think I'm that fragile?" I asked quietly. He stopped, thrown by the question. "What? No, of course not." "Then stop trying to make my decisions for me," I said, taking a step closer to him. "You think I don't know what I've been doing? You think I've just been passively letting you invade my space? Julian, I'm not a victim here. Every time you knocked on my door, I chose to open it. Every night you slept on my couch, and then in my bed, was a choice I made. Every time I put my hand on your back, it was a choice." My voice grew stronger with every word, the truth of it anchoring me. "You're not a burden. You're Julian. You're the most important person in my life. And yes, you're going through a hard time. And yes, you're leaning on me. That's what people do for each other. That's what friendship is. That's what love is." The word hung in the air between us, shimmering and terrifying and undeniable. I had said it. After all these years, I had finally said it. Julian just stared at me, his eyes wide, his frantic energy finally stilled. The fight seemed to go out of him, replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability. "Leo," he breathed, his voice filled with a kind of wonder. You love me?" "I've loved you for 10 years, you idiot," I said, and this time, the sound that escaped me was a small, watery laugh of pure, unadulterated relief. The secret was out. The vault was open, and the world hadn't ended. He closed the distance between us in 2 strides and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a fierce, desperate hug. He buried his face in my shoulder, and I felt his body begin to shake with silent, shuddering sobs. He wasn't the strong one, the one who had it all together. He was just as lost and scared as anyone else. And he had finally let me see it. I held him tightly, my own eyes burning with tears. I put my hand on his back, that familiar, sacred spot between his shoulders, and I felt him cling to me, not as a burden, but as an anchor. We stood there for a long time, in the middle of his messy apartment, holding on to each other as if we were the only two people in the world. The storm had finally broken, and in its wake, there was only a profound, cleansing, and beautiful silence. The days that followed were quiet, tentative, like the first green shoots of spring pushing up through a frozen landscape. There was no grand, cinematic declaration, no sudden transformation. Instead, it was a slow, deliberate process of rebuilding, of learning a new way to be together. We talked. We talked for hours, for days, unspooling years of unspoken thoughts and feelings. He told me about the crushing loneliness that had been his constant companion since he'd started his job, the feeling of being disconnected from his own life. He admitted that his late-night arrivals at my door were not just about exhaustion. They were about a desperate need for connection, for the quiet, unconditional acceptance he only ever found with me. I, in turn, told him about the years of silent pining, the careful dance of friendship I had performed, the ache of watching him with other people. We laid all our cards on the table, all our fears and hopes and insecurities, until there were no secrets left between us. It was terrifying, and it was liberating. He started staying at my apartment again, but it was different now. There was no pretext, no plausible deniability. He was there because he wanted to be with me, and I was there because I wanted him to be. When we got into bed at night, he would turn to me, not away from me. He would curl into my side, his head resting on my chest, and I would wrap my arms around him. My hand would find its familiar place on his back, but the gesture was no longer a one-way transmission of comfort. It was a circuit. His hand would rest on my waist, his thumb drawing slow, idle circles on my shirt. We would lie like that in the comfortable silence, listening to the rhythm of each other's breathing, and I would feel a sense of peace so deep and profound it felt like it was settling into my very bones. He was still tired. The stress of his job hadn't magically vanished, but the frantic, anxious edge was gone. The restless energy that had always driven him was replaced by a gentle stillness. He was finally, truly at rest. Because he knew he was home, small things began to change. He started leaving work at a reasonable hour. He made plans for us on the weekends, trips to a museum, long walks in the park, lazy Sunday mornings spent reading in bed. He was reclaiming his life, piece by piece, and he was inviting me into the center of it. I took a photograph of him one afternoon. He was sitting on my windowsill, the late afternoon sun backlighting him, a soft, genuine smile on his face as he watched me. When I developed the print in the darkroom, I saw that the image was different from all the others I had taken of him. In the old photos, he was always a subject I was observing from a distance, a beautiful but separate entity. In this one, he was looking right at me, his gaze direct and open and full of a quiet love that was meant only for me. The photographer was no longer just an observer. I was part of the picture. The loneliness that had haunted my art for so long was finally gone. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I opened my eyes and saw Julian standing in the doorway of the bedroom, holding 2 mugs. He had a soft, sleepy smile on his face. The morning light caught in his messy hair, creating a golden halo around his head. He looked beautiful. He looked happy. He looked like he belonged there. He walked over and handed me a mug, then climbed back into bed beside me. He leaned over and gave me a slow, sweet kiss that tasted of coffee and contentment. "I was thinking," he said, settling back against the pillows. "My lease is up in 2 months." I looked at him over the rim of my mug, my heart giving a hopeful little leap. Yeah, he said, his eyes meeting mine. "And I'm paying a ridiculous amount of money for an apartment I'm never in. And all my stuff is basically here anyway." He gestured around my room, at his pile of clothes on the chair, his book on the nightstand, his laptop on my desk. "So, I was thinking, maybe I just don't renew it." It wasn't a question, not really. It was a statement of intent. It was the final wall coming down, the last boundary being erased. It was him telling me that this, our shared space, our quiet life, was not a temporary refuge. It was the destination. "I think," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face, "that's a really good idea." We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. The quiet that had once been a space I filled with my own yearning and analysis was now a shared territory, a sanctuary we built and maintained together. It was a quiet filled not with absence, but with presence. It was the comfortable silence of two people who knew they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The axis of my world had pivoted on that long-ago Tuesday night, tilting me into a new and unknown orbit. I had been terrified of the change, of the potential for destruction. But as I sat there, sipping coffee in the morning light with the man I loved, I realized that my world hadn't fractured at all. It had simply, finally, come into perfect, beautiful focus.